Chapter 2: The Traditional Sources and Their Reliability. The purpose of this chapter is to gauge the reliability of the key sources available for Britain during the 1st century. It will look at the chief authors, their work, their credibility amongst contemporaries, their sources, and if any of these are supported by corroborative evidence, to establish the fundamentals of the subject more accurately. It appears self-evident from archaeological finds and certain literary works that a relationship began between Britain and Rome during the final century BC. Nevertheless, the pre-existing narrative and detail on this relationship appear to have been fundamentally altered during a paradigm shift in European history, the Renaissance. During this time, the humanist obsession with classical antiquity invoked a virulent strain of imitation and resulted in a millennium of European history being shrouded under the moniker of the Dark Ages. The predominance of these elaborated histories remains deeply ingrained in the national psyche despite their incredibility. Indeed, it is only since the Renaissance that British history began in AD 43. During the 15th and 16th century, a number of Italian humanists enthusiastically published their recent antique finds, which consisted of elaborative classical narratives of Rome's subjugation of Britain. The reports detailed Emperor Claudius's invasion, his use of elephants in Essex, and his prompt victory over the British within a fortnight. They also gave us Boudicca, who led a rebellion against Rome in AD 60 in retaliation for the rape of her daughters by Roman centurions. We are told that she burned several Roman towns, gave a rousing speech, and died gloriously in battle or took poison at an unrecorded location. Finally, Britain resigned itself to the supremacy of Rome until the 5th century, before being contritely abandoned and immediately invaded by Germans. The classical authors responsible for detailing this accepted historical genesis of Britain are Tacitus and Cassius Dio. This is despite the glaring anomalies surrounding the authors and their stories. Critical historical analysis of the inconsistencies within both works has been largely ignored, as has been the plain absence of contemporary validation and archaeological support. Undoubtedly, this critical process has been hindered by the retention of the subject, Rome and Britain, under the authority of classics departments across universities. The quest for knowledge on the period has been fundamentally stymied by the obedient focus on the Latin, rather than the credibility of its authors. The present chapter will progress systematically and chronologically through the classical authors Tacitus and Dio, followed by the medieval historians Gildas, Bede, and Geoffrey of Monmouth, to uncover their reliability and usefulness as sources on 1st century Britain. The classical authors. Tacitus is believed to have been an author, historian, Roman senator, consul, and a proconsul of Asia, who began writing towards the end of the 1st century. In chronological order, his works are reported to have been Agricola, AD 98, Germania, AD 98, Dialogue on Oratory, AD 102, Histories, AD 100 to 110, and Annals, AD 117. The latter two are deemed his most sizable works. Histories is comprised of 4 books, and a part of a 5th, which recounts the year of the 4 emperors, AD 69 to 70, and is primarily concerned with Rome's preoccupation with civil war. Annals is believed to have originally comprised of 16 books. However, only copies of books 1 to 4 and 11 to 16, as well as part of book 5, remain. What survives of the Annals covers the period between the ascension of Tiberius and Nero's reign. It is essentially a history of Rome, which is preoccupied with the question of how senators can operate under an autocracy. The remaining 3 books are monographs, which are considerably shorter and have all survived in their entirety. Agricola is a biography of Tacitus's father-in-law, which principally recounts his time as governor of Britain between 77 and 84 AD, and rapidly concludes with Agricola's recall to Rome, immediate retirement and subsequent death in relative obscurity within 10 years. Germania is a contemporary ethnographic account of the ancient Germans, while Oratory is a short discourse on rhetoric. Very little is known of Tacitus, whose name ironically translates as silent, and he was arguably unknown throughout the Middle Ages until the Renaissance. Only a single medieval manuscript, which dates to the 11th century, is believed to be the oldest extant Tacitus manuscript. All other works ascribed to Tacitus are from the 15th century. Giambiagio Conte provides a succinct and necessary account of the discovery and publication of Tacitus during this period. The traditionalist stance is that during the 14th century it is probable that either Boccaccio or Zenobi da Strada discovered the lone medieval manuscript of Annales 11-16 and the Historiae in Monte Cassino. It also assumes that it may have been removed from there by Boccaccio and then acquired by Niccolo Niccoli from the latter's private library. A librarian's note on the verso of the opening flyleaf indicates that it passed from the estate of Niccolo Niccoli after his death in 1437 and now resides at the Medicean Library in Florence. Niccolo Niccoli was a Florentine magnate and prolific letter writer who devoted his whole time and fortune to the acquisition of ancient manuscripts, of which he was eminently successful. He was also the patron of Poggio Bracciolini, who rediscovered a Tacitus manuscript at Hersfeld Abbey in 1425, which Enoch of Ascoli brought to Rome in 1455. Poggio was apostolic secretary to 8 successive popes during the first half of the 15th century, and his gross assets rose from 566 florins to 18,500 florins in the years following his discovery of Tacitus. In 1508, the Annales 1-6 were discovered at Corvey, and they were also brought to Rome. The first publication of Tacitus was in 1470, the Editio Princeps, which included the Annales 11-16, the Historiae, the Germania, and the Dialogus. Subsequently, the Agricola was published in 1476, and finally the Annals 1-6 in 1515. Fragmentary pieces of the histories, beyond the first 5 books, are too loosely connected to the professed author, Tacitus. In his paper on this subject, T.D. Barnes concludes that a firm distinction must always be drawn between fragments which preserve the actual words of a lost work, reports of its contents, and traces of it surviving in later writers. With regard to Tacitus's histories, Barnes warns that the traditionally presented 8 fragments shrink to a single fragment, and that editors of Tacitus have a clear duty to do justice to the true complexity of the facts. The vast majority of classical works have reached us because of efforts during the Renaissance period. However, the ancient manuscripts concerning Tacitus have invariably been lost or consumed by fire within years of their copying and publication during the Renaissance. Rex Winsbury explains of Pliny's letters that all 10 books of the letters dates back to a single ancient manuscript in codex form that survived in Paris until its rediscovery in the dawning age of the Renaissance. A mere 6 leaves survive. It should also be of significant concern that Tacitus, discovered during the 15th century, makes no mention of Pliny, whereas the 16th century discovery of Pliny has them as the greatest of friends. Moreover, Juvenal mentions neither, despite his renown for taking side swipes at large numbers of his contemporaries. In fact, Juvenal himself exemplifies the historic corroboration and reliability which Tacitus, Pliny, and Dio simply do not have. Juvenal and his satires are mentioned by his contemporary Martial during the 1st century, quoted directly by Lactantius, 240 to 320 AD, and cited more than 70 times by Servius. Moreover, by the middle of the 4th century, the satires had been edited and published with a commentary, imitated by the poet Ausonius, and championed by the historian Ammianus. They were also present in the library of Charlemagne, which was established during the 9th century, and were so widely circulated that more than 500 manuscripts of Juvenal survive to this day. The history of Tacitus' text and manuscripts has been documented by both J. H. Shillman and Malcolm Smith, respectively, over the last century. They appear to be in agreement, and their conclusions universally accepted. The former arguably gives a more candid appraisal, while the latter approaches the topic retrospectively through the writers of the Renaissance. Nevertheless, this present assessment of reliability will examine the inherent assumptions which prescribe Tacitus with classical source status. Shillman forewarns that in ancient times, Tacitus was by no means so popular an author as his greatness might lead us to expect. References to his works are surprisingly few. Smith confirms that it was not until the 16th century that interest in Tacitus appears to have grown. Without obvious exception, all documentary evidence of Tacitus's existence in late antiquity is discovered, published, and expediently lost during the Renaissance. It is therefore necessary to evaluate the traditionally presented evidence of Tacitus in and since antiquity. Jean Baudin, writing in 1566, introduced the notion that Tacitus was criticized by early Christian writers, namely Tertullian in the 3rd century and Paulus Orosius in the 5th century. The oldest extant manuscript containing Tertullian is the mutilated original of the 11th century Codex Agobardinus in Paris, which was first printed by Martin Mesnard at Paris 1545. The lost original allegedly contained 19 chapters and was cited by St. Jerome. However, the authenticity and reliability of St. Jerome's letters themselves appears utterly marred by Erasmus's own Herculean labours in editing and imaginings of Jerome's work during the Renaissance. Erasmus shamelessly interpolated great sections of Jerome's work. I worked myself to death that Jerome might live again. With regard to Tertullian, Erasmus expressly replaced Jerome's Quidam Nostrorum, some of our brethren, with his own assumption, Cyprian or Tertullian. The significant reconstruction of Jerome's letters by Erasmus utterly undermines our knowledge of Tertullian and his professed knowledge of Tacitus. The presumed references of Tertullian are drawn from an unidentifiable, non-existent forerunner to the mutilated 11th century Codex Agobardinus. Reliance on such unverifiable evidence is fanciful at best. Orosius' 5th century history became one of the primary sources of information about antiquity in the Middle Ages. However, his recounting of the facts is often unimpressive, and the sources upon which he depended are well known. Livy, Caesar's Gallic Wars, and the Chronicle of Eusebius. Tacitus is ascribed classical authenticity because of Orosius's citation of the former. Orosius's reference relates to a summarization of 2 Old Testament stories, Genesis and Exodus, within Histories, 5.3. However, it is difficult to believe and ultimately flawed. Firstly, the quote reads, Cornelius tells us, which assumes Tacitus's forename is Cornelius. However, F.R.D. Goodyear has convincingly disproven this perpetuated assumption in his edition of the Annals of Tacitus. Secondly, A.T. Fear states that Orosius is either the victim of a corrupt manuscript or guilty of hasty reading and finding what he wished to find in Tacitus's text, or, more seriously, of a deliberate manipulation of the text. Despite these glaring flaws in Orosius, Tacitus' knowledge of the Jewish stories would be unremarkable, if not expected. Indeed, he could well have gleaned his knowledge of the fundamental stories of the Torah from his contemporary Flavius Josephus. However, Tacitus never once acknowledges Josephus or his work, despite wholly plagiarizing Josephus's Antiquities and History of the Jewish War. William Whiston, writing on this very subject, appears incandescent. Tacitus was an eminent reader and writer of history at Rome during the time that Josephus had been there studying the Greek language, reading the Greek books, and writing his own works in the same Greek language, which language was almost universally known at Rome in that age. Therefore, it is next to impossible to suppose that Tacitus could be unacquainted with the writings of Josephus, nor is it other than a very surprising paradox to me how it has been possible for learned men to be so very silent about this matter, especially when not only the correspondence of the authors as to time and place, but the likeness of the subject matter and circumstances is so very remarkable, such as could hardly be taken by a foreigner from any other author than from our Josephus. This strange silence is almost unaccountable, if not inexcusable. Furthermore, it is widely accepted that the Old Testament was first translated into Greek, the lingua franca of intellectuals in Rome, circa 300 BC. This challenges Tacitus's contrived ignorance of the monotheistic theme of Genesis and Exodus, which he alludes to in the Histories, and resembles more the anti-Semitic culture of the Renaissance. David Price, in his work on the Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer, explains that by and large, Renaissance artists and writers relished the opportunity to portray Jews as hateful Christ killers and disregard their history and religion. Notable figures who feature elsewhere in this chapter: Leonardo Bruni, an ardent protagonist of Greek, condemned Hebrew knowledge as useless and even pernicious, and Poggio Bracciolini, the preeminent figure in the story of Tacitus, stereotyped Jews as stupid, peevish, crazy, and ignorant. Martin Luther, father of the Reformation and author of The Jews and Their Lies, exemplifies the caustic Christian diatribe directed towards the Jews during the Renaissance. Such ignorance from a respected first-century Greek-speaking Roman intellectual concerning the basic monotheistic theme of Genesis and Exodus is inconceivable. The history's non-recognition of Jewish fundamentality to Christianity smacks more of the Renaissance than of first-century authorship, when the two religions were essentially inseparable. During the 4th century, Flavius Vopiscus cites Tacitus in his alleged contribution to the Historia Augusta. Unfortunately, the work has been consistently and successfully discredited for almost 2 centuries. In the 19th century, C. Chwalina and H. Dessau independently published damning critiques of the Historia Augusta, which remain widely accepted. They concluded that the universal style, additions and arbitrary changes, and frequent historical inaccuracy demonstrated its widespread forgery and unreliability as a historical source, not least in the works attributed to Vopiscus. As with Erasmus's treatment of Jerome, recurrent interpolations during the Renaissance moved from notes and comments within the margins to the body of the text. No pre-Renaissance manuscripts survive this process. The 21st century has seen continued confirmation that the Historia Augusta was of single authorship and remains significantly marred by the humanistic accretion of the text. In his recent re-examination of the work, David Rohrbacher finds that the Historia Augusta combines false and invented passages with passages drawn from traditional historians that we no longer possess. With regard to Vopiscus, Rohrbacher laments that the question of sources becomes particularly tricky because the author has largely freed himself from dependence on facts and simply enjoyed creative play, with unidentifiable literary sources. In 1556, the Historia Sacra was first printed. It is assumed that its author knew Tacitus's annals because of irreconcilable similarities between the two authors' work. Historia Sacra was allegedly written in the 5th century by Sulpicius Severus. He is conspicuously absent from extant contemporaries' work, and he makes no mention of Tacitus whatsoever. Moreover, his history abounds with chronological errors and blunders of all kinds. He invariably copied others verbatim and unsuspectingly. Nonetheless, his Latin was revered and earned him the sobriquet the Christian Sallust, and he was deemed the purest ecclesiastical writer by Joseph Scaliger, 1540 to 1609, after the Historia Sacra's publication. John Wilson Ross was convinced that Tacitus's annals was a forgery, claiming that Tacitus's choice of words was inexplicable, and his curious grammatical inflections were unnecessary and inaccurate compared to those of Severus, which appear clear, precise, and fluent. Severus's superior Latin, according to Ross, demonstrated his originality and precedence over the Tacitus's annals. Ross's suspicions of forgery during the Renaissance are well-founded, as there was a prolific fake market which prized convincing imitations of the classics. Unfortunately, Ross's attention focused primarily on disproving the annals' authenticity, and overlooked that of Severus. Dr. Joseph Lussell and Professor Andrew Kane show concern that Severus himself is absent from Jerome's extant correspondence with the Gauls, our main source for 5th century Christian activity in Europe. Severus, the most prolific Gallic ecclesiastical writer of his day, is totally absent from Jerome's correspondence. Jerome, on the other hand, features repeatedly in Severus's own work, which also claims they shared friends and contemporaries. It is telling that the Historia Sacra contains no remarkable information unknown before its 16th century publication. It is strewn with errors and enjoys no corroborative evidence. In light of this, the most logical explanation is that the Historia Sacra is a 16th century construction of historical inaccuracies and interpolation by an eloquent Latinist. The creator of the Historia Sacra during the Renaissance may well have read and copied the Renaissance publication of Tacitus, but that categorically fails to prove that Tacitus or Severus existed before the vigorous cutthroat trade in manuscripts took off during the Renaissance. The 6th century author Jordanes, author of History of the Goths, is commonly presented as evidence of Tacitus's classical credentials. The assumption of Jordanes' knowledge of Tacitus holds to a single sentence within his work. Cornelius etiam annalium scripta, Cornelius was the author of the Annals. This is irreconcilably problematic. Firstly, because the works of Tacitus were not named Annals or divided into two parts, histories and annals, until the 16th century. And secondly, because the assumption that Cornelius was Tacitus's forename has already been disproven. Further claims have been made that whole sections of Tacitus's work are evident in German authors from the 9th and 10th centuries. The supposed evidence is within Einhard, Charlemagne's 9th century biographer, who was associated with the Abbey of Fulda. He purportedly knew the histories and the Germania because he incorporated extracts from the latter. Rudolf of Fulda, writing in the 9th century, is also accused of borrowing whole chapters from Germania without acknowledging their source, as is Widukind of Corvey a century later, who appears to have read Germania. Considering that no credible evidence of Tacitus has presented itself up to or during this period, the accusations of plagiarism levelled at the aforementioned authors from Fulda and Corvey are baseless. The manuscript discovered at Hersfeld gave no indication of its author and was first described by Poggio as trifles in 1425. By 1455, it has transformed into several complete and entire monographs, ascribed solely to Tacitus. It seems that Poggio's Germania is in fact a plagiarized compilation of the 9th and 10th century works written at Fulda and Corvey by Einhard, Rudolf and Widukind. The Hersfeld manuscript also contained two other monographs, Agricola and Oratory. Copies of these have survived in their entirety. However, the original manuscript was expediently lost after publication. The dialogue on Oratory's authenticity continues to be doubted on stylistic grounds. While Agricola was never quoted, cited, or even acknowledged prior to its publication in 1476. The irreconcilable variations in style between the first and second halves of the Annals and the other works of Tacitus continue to undermine Tacitus's authenticity. The 12th century, however, provides us with a revelation concerning the origin of Tacitus. In Polycraticus, John of Salisbury concludes his piece on tyrannicide by providing a list of classical authors who have written on the subject. Peter of Blois, a near contemporary of John's, who took from the latter's work verbatim, successfully identified innuendo in John's list. Two of the supposed ancient authors who wrote on tyranny were Serenus and Tranquillus, serene and peaceful. They are fictions and were included solely for comic effect. Unfortunately, however, Peter failed to identify the third pun within the list. Tacitus, silent. In his ignorance, Peter pretended to have frequently looked into Tacitus, an author never mentioned by such well-informed contemporaries as Giraldus Cambrensis and Ralph of Diceto. This is the first and only genuine citation of Tacitus before the Renaissance, and it was a joke. John's inclusion of Tacitus in his trio of fictional authors on tyranny is overt and literarily unremarkable. It is, when revealed, a blatant application of omne trium perfectum, the classic rule of three. Despite the evident failure of Peter of Blois and innumerable humanists and Latinists to fully appreciate John's witticism, it is unambiguous and undeniable. Tacitus, Serenus, and Tranquillus, silent, serene, and peaceful. It is not until the 19th century that assumptions of Boccaccio's knowledge of Tacitus began. Julia Haig-Geisser believes that this mistaken idea was carried by Pierre de Nolhac in 1892 and was perpetuated by Enrico Rostagno a decade later. Their theories were based upon Boccaccio's fabled visit to the library at Monte Cassino, which they uncritically extended. This mistaken idea grew into the assumption that Boccaccio made use of Tacitus in his Commento di Dante, circa 1374. However, the most influential Dantean scholar of his time, Paget Toynbee, cannot justify why Petrarch, the famous friend and correspondent of Boccaccio, never once quotes or even mentions the name of Tacitus. Since the Renaissance, the foundation of British history has been based on the accounts of Tacitus and Cassius Dio. The latter, traditionally accepted as writing in the 3rd century, makes no mention of Tacitus or his works, yet replicates his work significantly. Academics have excused these obvious similarities by suggesting that the authors probably drew on a common source. and Dio provided additional details which are lacking in Tacitus. Nonetheless, the most striking similarity between Tacitus and Dio is their historic invisibility until the Renaissance. The oldest extant manuscript containing Dio is believed to be the Vaticanus Graecus. This vellum manuscript consists of a few leaves and was possibly produced in the late 5th or early 6th century in the library at Caesarea, but the evidence of this is not strong, and the codex can only be said with confidence to have come from Syria-Palestine in general. Nevertheless, this fragmentary manuscript teems with errors, many of which are corrected by a second hand. It was discovered and published by the Italian humanist Fulvio Orsini in 1582. The Orsini family was one of oldest and most illustrious Italian noble families, which had provided 2 popes and dozens of cardinals prior to Fulvio's birth. Nonetheless, the family's involvement in a conspiracy against the House of Borgia caused several leading family members to be murdered and their lands taken during the Renaissance. The abandoned Fulvio begged alms and became a ward and chorister of the church aged 9. His education focused on the ancient languages, and he soon became a prolific discoverer and publisher of antique manuscripts, most of which found their way into the Vatican Library. Aside from the Vaticanus Graecus, Fulvio allegedly discovered further manuscripts of Dio. Carelessly, however, he allowed them to be destroyed by fire after copying them. In 1548, Stephanus was the first to publish Dio's work. It provides the traditional telling of the Claudian invasion and is drawn from 2 15th century manuscripts. It was a publishing success, and within 3 years, Stephanus printed the Epitomes of Dio, which gleaned information from work attributed to an 11th century Byzantium monk and copyist, Xiphilinus. The Epitomes conspicuously utilize, mimic, and enhance the information on Britain from the 1470 publication of Tacitus's Annals. Confirmation of Dio's writing before 1548 is not forthcoming. Indeed, the Italian humanist and commissioned author of Anglica Historia, Polydore Virgil, makes absolutely no mention of Dio when reporting on his laborious pursuit of sources for his topic. Like Tacitus, Dio's absence from history, citation or acknowledgement before the Renaissance is remarkable, relevant, and revelatory. Manuscripts were invariably discovered during the Renaissance before being either severely mutilated, destroyed, or lost. As historical sources, Tacitus and Dio are unreliable. They are fabrications, created during a time of shifting power and significant change in Europe. Furthermore, the litmus paper of archaeology pays no credence whatsoever to the stories presented in their supposed works.